Nobody listens to a worthless
Get your filthy
drifter.
hands off my bike, you old black homeless freak. The tattooed biker slammed both palms into Isaiah Brooks' chest, sending the elderly black man crashing onto the pavement. His worn backpack burst open, scattering battered notebooks and rusty metal bolts across the road as the crowd erupted in laughter. Another rider kicked Isaiah's backpack into the ditch and laughed. "Shta, look at this old black bum. He probably hasn't had a shower in months, and now he thinks he can tell 20 bikers what to do." A third biker grabbed Isaiah by the collar, shoved him backward, and spat at his feet. "You're nothing but roadkill waiting to happen. Nobody listens to a worthless black drifter." The biker captain revved his engine until hot exhaust blasted Isaiah's face before barking one last insult. "When this ride is over, you'll still be sleeping under a bridge, because that's the only place people like you belong." Phones shot into the air. The crowd laughed louder, eager to capture the humiliation. Isaiah slowly pushed himself back up, his terrified eyes never leaving the aging steel bridge. His voice shook. "Please, don't cross it." The biker captain smirked. "The only thing collapsing today is your dignity. Move before we run you over." Isaiah suddenly threw himself across the entrance, screaming with every ounce of strength he had left. "Run, get off that bridge, it's about to fail." A deafening crack exploded through the steel. Every smile disappeared. Every motorcycle engine fell silent. And in a single terrifying second, everyone realized the homeless black man had just saved all 20 of their lives. If Isaiah's courage deserves respect, type "respect" in the comments along with your city and local time. And if you believe true heroes are often the ones the world overlooks, subscribe now, because the shocking truth about this homeless black man is far more powerful than anyone could imagine. Oh, good to have you here. The best directions I've ever gotten came from someone who couldn't read a map either. Let's follow them. The bridge had been closed for nearly 48 hours. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the mountain wind, while twisted steel hung over the canyon like broken bones. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters called it a miracle that not a single biker had died. But no one was talking about the miracle. They were talking about the homeless black man. Isaiah Brooks had vanished. By sunrise the next morning, social media was flooded with shaky cell phone videos showing the moment he screamed, "Run, get off that bridge." Millions argued over who he was. Some called him a hero. Others insisted he had somehow caused the collapse. Isaiah didn't care. He quietly pushed an old shopping cart through the back streets of Cedar Ridge, collecting discarded bottles before the town fully woke up. His shelter sat beneath an abandoned railway bridge nearly 2 miles away from the collapsed highway crossing. It wasn't much more than a weathered tent protected by blue tarps tied to rusted beams. Inside sat a folding chair, 2 blankets, canned food neatly stacked against one wall, and dozens of notebooks filled with tiny handwritten numbers. Every page contained sketches of bridges, steel joints, load calculations, stress fractures. No one had ever bothered to ask why. To the people of Cedar Ridge, Isaiah wasn't a man. He was simply Bridge Bum. Around 9 that morning, Isaiah stopped outside Miller's grocery to exchange bottles for a few dollars. The teenage cashier frowned the moment he saw him. "Not you again." Isaiah offered a tired smile. "I just need to cash these in." Before the young man could answer, the store owner, Carl Miller, stormed out from the stockroom. "I told you last week to stay away from my customers. I've done nothing wrong." Carl snatched the bag of bottles from Isaiah's hands and dumped it onto the sidewalk. Glass rolled in every direction. "I don't care what happened yesterday," Carl barked. "People like you scare business away." Several customers watched from the parking lot. Nobody helped. One woman covered her little daughter's eyes as though Isaiah were dangerous. Carl jabbed a finger toward the street. Go beg somewhere else. Isaiah slowly bent down his aging knees, trembling as he gathered each bottle one by one. Not once did he argue. Not once did he raise his voice. Across the street, two teenagers recognized him from the viral video. Hey! One lifted his phone. That's the crazy bridge guy. His friend laughed. Ask him when the next bridge is falling. Within seconds, they were recording. Isaiah quietly picked up the last bottle and walked away, while their laughter echoed behind him. By noon, television crews had arrived at Town Hall. Mayor Victor Hale stood confidently behind a row of microphones, wearing a pressed navy suit and a carefully rehearsed smile. The investigation into yesterday's bridge collapse is ongoing, he announced. Thankfully, thanks to emergency response teams, no lives were lost. A reporter raised her hand. Mayor Hale, several witnesses say a homeless man warned everyone before the collapse. Victor's smile tightened. Stuckey say, we appreciate concerned citizens, but we should avoid spreading myths. So you don't believe he knew anything? The man has been wandering around that bridge for years, Victor replied dismissively. He's mentally unstable. Any correct guess was pure coincidence. Another reporter pressed harder. Should investigators speak with him? Victor chuckled. Gee, I think law enforcement has more reliable witnesses than an unemployed drifter living under a bridge. Laughter rippled through part of the crowd. Isaiah, standing unnoticed at the edge of the gathering with his shopping cart, heard every word. His expression never changed. He simply turned around and walked away. Only one person noticed. A young journalist named Emily Carter lowered her camera. Something about Isaiah's silence bothered her. Most people who were publicly humiliated reacted with anger. Isaiah reacted with sadness. There was a difference. Late that afternoon, Isaiah returned to the collapsed bridge. Police barricades blocked every entrance. Engineers wearing reflective jackets inspected twisted beams, while drones hovered overhead. Isaiah stood quietly behind the tape. His eyes moved from one fractured support to another. Almost unconsciously, he whispered numbers under his breath. Compression. North joint. Failure propagated from the secondary gusset. A state engineer nearby suddenly turned. What did you just say? Isaiah looked up. Nothing. The engineer frowned. You've seen bridge failures before? Isaiah simply smiled. I've watched this one die for a long time. Before the engineer could ask another question, Sheriff Daniel Ross walked over. There he is. The sheriff sighed. Isaiah, you need to leave. I'm not causing trouble. I know, but people are getting nervous. Isaiah glanced toward the broken steel stretching across the canyon. They're looking at the wrong place. What do you mean? Isaiah hesitated. Then he quietly answered. If that support failed the way I think it did. He stopped himself. Sheriff Ross waited. Isaiah slowly shook his head. It doesn't matter. Without another word, he turned away. The sheriff watched him disappear down the mountain road, unable to explain why the old homeless man spoke less like a drifter, and more like someone who understood every bolt holding that bridge together. Meanwhile, inside Town Hall, Mayor Victor Hale closed the conference room door behind him. His friendly smile vanished. He looked toward the town attorney and whispered, Find every maintenance report from the last 20 years. The attorney looked confused. Why? Victor's face hardened. 'Cause if that old man starts talking? He paused, his fingers tightening around a folder stamped confidential. Everything we've buried is about to come back. The rumors spread faster than the investigation. Some people called Isaiah Brooks a miracle. Others called him a fraud. By the third morning after the bridge collapse, every television station in Colorado had replayed the same 15-second clip of the elderly black homeless man screaming for 20 bikers to run. Yet no one had bothered to ask the most important question. How had he known? Isaiah sat alone beneath the abandoned railway bridge, carefully sharpening a carpenter's pencil with an old pocket knife. Before him lay another worn notebook, its pages filled with hand-drawn bridge diagrams stretching back nearly 2 decades. Every crack, every loose rivet, every rust stain had been recorded by date. A familiar engine rolled onto the gravel road. Sheriff Daniel Ross stepped from his patrol SUV carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you might need something warm." Isaiah looked surprised. "You don't have to be kind to me, Sheriff." Daniel handed him a cup anyway. "I wasn't kind enough before." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Tell me something." Isaiah remained quiet. "How did you know that bridge was going to fail?" Isaiah stared toward the canyon. "I didn't know." Daniel frowned. You were certain enough to throw yourself in front of 20 motorcycles." Isaiah nodded slowly. "I recognized the sound. The sound, when steel is tired, it speaks." Daniel looked confused. Isaiah gently tapped his notebook. "Most people hear noise. I hear warnings." Before Daniel could ask another question, his radio crackled. "Unit 3, respond to Town Hall immediately." The sheriff sighed. "I'll come back." Isaiah offered only a faint smile. "I'll still be here." Inside Town Hall, panic had begun replacing confidence. Mayor Victor Hale slammed another folder onto the conference table. "Why are reporters asking about maintenance records?" Town Attorney Leonard Price shifted nervously. Emily Carter filed a public records request. Victor's face darkened. "Reject it. We can't. Then delay it." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." Leonard hesitated. "Mayor." Victor leaned closer. "Nobody digs into 18-year-old bridge inspections." His voice dropped to a whisper. Especially not because of some homeless black man." Neither man noticed Deputy Clerk Susan Morales quietly standing outside the half-open door. She heard every word. Meanwhile, Emily Carter refused to let the story die. The 29-year-old investigative reporter had watched Isaiah's interview clips dozens of times. Something felt wrong. He never once asked for attention, never accepted praise, never even defended himself. People hiding lies usually talked too much. Isaiah barely spoke at all. Emily drove to the county archives, hoping to learn who he had been before homelessness. The elderly records clerk typed his name. Nothing appeared. She tried again. Still nothing. "That's strange. What is, there should be something." Emily folded her arms. "Everyone leaves a paper trail." The clerk nodded. "Unless someone erased it." Those words lingered in Emily's mind. That afternoon, the surviving bikers gathered outside Riverside Garage. The mood had changed completely. Nobody laughed anymore. Their leader, Travis Cole, replayed the cell phone footage on his phone. Frame by frame, Isaiah's face filled the screen. Terrified, desperate. Not once did he look confused. One younger rider finally spoke. "That wasn't guessing." Another nodded. He knew. A broad-shouldered biker named Marcus Reed had hardly spoken since the collapse. Formerly a firefighter, Marcus had spent years studying structural failures during rescue operations. Something about Isaiah's behavior haunted him. "He wasn't looking at us." "What do you mean?" Travis asked. Marcus paused the video. He never watched the motorcycles. He zoomed in. He kept watching the suspension cables. Silence filled the garage. Marcus continued, "When firefighters hear buildings talk." He looked around the room. "We leave." Travis slowly lowered his phone. "You think that old man recognized the warning signs?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I think he recognized them because he'd heard them before." Late that evening, Isaiah quietly walked back toward the collapsed bridge. The area had emptied for the night. Floodlights illuminated twisted steel against the dark mountains. He stopped beside the barricade. His eyes scanned every broken support. His breathing grew heavier. Then he noticed something. Fresh scrape marks, not from the collapse, from recently removed bolts. Isaiah froze. Someone had been working on the bridge after the disaster. His expression changed for the first time. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for the truth. Behind him, tires crunched over gravel. A black SUV pulled alongside the barricade. Two men in expensive suits stepped out. Neither wore construction gear. Neither introduced themselves. One simply looked Isaiah up and down before speaking coldly. "You've become quite famous." Isaiah remained silent. The taller man slipped an envelope from his coat. "There are $5,000 in cash." Isaiah didn't even glance at it. "What for?" The man smiled without warmth. "Leave Cedar Ridge." Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't?" The smile disappeared. "People already think you're crazy." He stepped closer. "It would be unfortunate if they started believing you're dangerous too." Isaiah looked directly into the man's eyes. For the first time in years, his voice carried quiet authority. "You aren't afraid of me." He glanced toward the shattered bridge. "You're afraid of what that bridge remembers." Both men exchanged a nervous look. Without another word, they climbed back into the SUV and drove away. Isaiah watched the taillights disappear into the darkness. High above him, hidden on a nearby utility pole, a traffic surveillance camera had silently recorded the entire encounter. Neither Isaiah nor the two mysterious men had any idea someone else had just captured the first real piece of evidence that this disaster was never just an accident. The black SUV disappeared into the darkness, leaving Isaiah Brooks alone beside the shattered bridge. He stood motionless, listening. Not to the wind. Not to the river roaring beneath the canyon. He was listening to the silence that followed a lie. After nearly a minute, he quietly turned and disappeared down the old service road, his worn boots crunching over loose gravel. High above him, the surveillance camera continued recording. The following morning, Cedar Ridge looked nothing like the quiet mountain town it had been a week earlier. Satellite news trucks crowded the streets. Curious tourists gathered near the police barricades. Vendors were already selling T-shirts reading "The Miracle Bridge Survivor." Isaiah hated every second of it. He slipped through an alley toward the public library, hoping to avoid attention. Instead, he walked straight into another crowd. "There he is!" A woman pointed first. Within seconds, half a dozen phones were aimed at him. "Hey! Tell us which bridge is falling next. Can you predict lottery numbers too?" Laughter erupted. Isaiah lowered his head and kept walking. Then another voice cut through the crowd. "What are you all clapping for?" Mayor Victor Hale stepped in front of the cameras with practiced confidence. "I know everyone wants a hero." He looked directly at Isaiah before continuing. "But this town won't build its future on superstition." He smiled politely toward reporters. "This man has lived beneath that bridge for years. Eventually, even a broken clock is right." Several people nodded. One television host laughed. Victor wasn't finished. Please don't confuse coincidence with expertise. The crowd began murmuring. Isaiah stopped walking, not because of the insults, because he realized Victor wasn't trying to discredit him. He was trying to make sure no one asked questions. Isaiah quietly turned away without saying a word. Victor watched him leave with visible relief. Across the street, Emily Carter lowered her camera. She wasn't filming Isaiah anymore. She was filming Victor. His confidence looked rehearsed. His relief looked real. Something didn't fit. She replayed the mayor's press conference from 2 days earlier on her tablet. Then today's statement. The wording was nearly identical, almost memorized. Why would someone repeat the same lie unless they were terrified of changing it? She whispered. By noon, Emily received a phone call. Ms. Carter, this is she. My name is Susan Morales. Emily immediately recognized the name, the deputy clerk from town hall. I think... Susan hesitated. I think the mayor is hiding something. Emily's heartbeat quickened. Can we meet? Not at town hall. Tonight, 6 o'clock, the old train depot. The call ended. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Ross sat alone inside his office reviewing body camera footage from the day of the collapse. Something suddenly caught his attention. Isaiah hadn't been looking at the bikers. Not once. He had been staring above them. Daniel paused the frame. The suspension cable. He zoomed in. Even through the grainy footage, something appeared wrong. One of the anchor plates seemed slightly twisted before the collapse. Daniel immediately called the state engineering team. Could that happen naturally? The engineer answered after a long silence. Possible, but unlikely. What would cause it? Someone altering structural hardware. Daniel slowly lowered the phone. Someone, not something. That evening, Isaiah sat outside his small shelter, repairing a broken flashlight. Marcus Reed approached quietly, carrying 2 paper bags. I figured you might be hungry. Isaiah smiled faintly. You keep bringing food. Marcus shrugged. You saved my life. Isaiah handed back 1 sandwich. Share it. Marcus sat beside him. For several minutes, they ate without speaking. Finally, Marcus asked, When you stopped us? Isaiah looked up. Were you afraid? Isaiah laughed softly. I've been afraid for 18 years. Marcus frowned. 18. Isaiah immediately realized he had said too much. He stood. I should get some sleep. Marcus wasn't ready to let the conversation end. 18 years ago. What happened? Isaiah stared toward the distant mountains. I trusted the wrong people. Before Marcus could ask another question, headlights swept across the hillside. 3 police cruisers rolled toward the campsite. Deputies climbed out. Sheriff Ross stepped from the lead vehicle. His expression was troubled. Not angry. Troubled. I'm sorry, Isaiah. Isaiah quietly nodded. They made you come. Daniel sighed. We received a complaint. What kind? Trespassing on state property? Marcus stood immediately. He's been living here for years. Daniel nodded. I know. Another deputy unfolded paperwork. You'll need to leave tonight. Marcus lost his temper. Seriously. After he saved 20 lives, the deputy looked uncomfortable. We're just following orders. Isaiah gently placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. It's all right. No, it isn't. Isaiah smiled anyway. It isn't your burden. Without arguing, he packed his blankets, notebooks, flashlight, and the old backpack that had become his entire world. As he lifted the final notebook, one deputy accidentally dropped it. Pages scattered into the dirt. Complex engineering sketches covered every sheet. The deputy blinked. "What is all this?" Before Isaiah could answer, another officer laughed. "Probably the ramblings of a crazy old homeless guy." The notebook was tossed back without another glance. Daniel noticed Isaiah's expression. Not anger, heartbreak. Those pages weren't meaningless. They were part of his life. Yet no one cared enough to look. Isaiah walked away from the camp carrying everything he owned on his back. Marcus watched in disbelief. "Where are you going?" Isaiah looked toward the dark outline of the mountains. "I've learned not to stay anywhere people don't want me." He disappeared into the night. Marcus stood frozen. Something inside him refused to accept that answer. Across town, Emily arrived at the abandoned train depot. Susan Morales was already waiting. She looked over both shoulders before pulling a thick manila envelope from her purse. "My conscience won't let me keep this anymore." Emily carefully opened it. Inside were photocopies of maintenance requests dating back nearly 20 years. Most carried the same recommendation. Urgent structural inspection required. Every request had been denied. Then Emily noticed something else. The earliest report wasn't signed by the mayor. It carried another name. A name that had been crossed out with thick black ink, but not enough to erase it completely. Emily leaned closer. Under the scribbled marker, a few faded letters remained visible. "Isaiah, bro." Her eyes widened. She looked up at Susan. "Who is Isaiah Brooks?" Susan swallowed hard. "I don't know who he used to be." She glanced nervously toward Town Hall, glowing in the distance. "But I know one thing. The mayor has spent 18 years making sure nobody ever finds out." Far away, walking alone beneath the cold Colorado night, Isaiah had no idea that the first crack in the conspiracy had finally appeared. And this time, it wasn't the bridge that was beginning to collapse. It was the lie that had buried his life for nearly 2 decades. By dawn, the story had exploded far beyond Cedar Ridge. Every major news network in Colorado led with the same headline. "Homeless man saves 20 bikers before bridge collapse." The cell phone video surpassed 15 million views overnight. Comment sections were filled with one question. Who is Isaiah Brooks? For the first time in years, strangers across the country defended the man the town had mocked for nearly 2 decades. But inside Cedar Ridge's town hall, panic had replaced confidence. Mayor Victor Hale stared at the television mounted on his office wall. Every station replayed Isaiah throwing himself in front of the motorcycles. Victor muted the screen. "This has gone too far." Town attorney Leonard Price stood silently beside him. "The state has opened an independent investigation." Victor's jaw tightened. "Over a bridge." Leonard hesitated. "Not anymore. They're investigating everything." Victor slowly turned toward the window overlooking Main Street. "Find Isaiah." Leonard frowned. "And do what?" Victor answered without looking back. "Before someone else does." Miles away, Isaiah walked alone along an abandoned railroad trail leading out of town. He had slept beneath an old freight car after being forced to leave his campsite. His backpack rested heavily across his shoulders. Inside were the only possessions he had left. The notebooks. He stopped beside a quiet stream, removed one weathered journal, and gently brushed dirt from its faded cover. Written across the front in black ink were 4 words. Bridge Monitoring Log Year 1. Isaiah slowly opened the first page. The date read April 12th. 18 years earlier. His fingers lingered over the paper before quietly closing the notebook again. Not yet, he whispered to himself. He wasn't ready to remember. Meanwhile, Emily Carter finally received permission to inspect the bridge collapse site. The state engineering team had begun documenting every fractured beam. Lead investigator Daniel Mercer greeted her. "You've got 30 minutes. No touching anything." Emily nodded. She carefully walked across the restricted zone until one damaged anchor plate caught her attention. Unlike the others, it showed bright silver scratches beneath the rust. Fresh metal. She raised her camera. "Excuse me." An elderly engineer approached. "Something wrong," Emily pointed. "Shouldn't that surface be rusted too?" The engineer crouched beside it. Seconds later, his expression changed. "Interesting. What is it?" He ran a flashlight across the bolts. "Yeah, these were recently removed." Emily looked confused. "After the collapse?" The engineer slowly shook his head. "No." He stood. "Before." Within hours, that discovery reached the state investigation team. Sheriff Daniel Ross received an urgent phone call. "What?" He stood up immediately. "You're certain?" After hanging up, he drove directly to the bridge. The engineering supervisor met him holding a sealed evidence bag. Inside rested 2 broken bolts. "See these marks?" Daniel leaned closer. Soon they weren't snapped. "They were loosened first." A chill ran through the sheriff. So someone tampered with the bridge. The engineer nodded gravely. And whoever did it understood structural systems. Daniel's thoughts immediately returned to one person. Not Isaiah. Whoever had spent years making sure Isaiah would never be believed. That evening, Marcus Reed organized a gathering of every biker who had stood on that bridge. 20 motorcycles lined the parking lot outside Riverside Garage. Nobody wore party colors. Nobody laughed. Marcus stepped forward. "We owe a man our lives." Every rider nodded. "We let people treat him like garbage." Silence followed. One older biker finally spoke. "I shoved him." Another lowered his head. "I called him crazy." The youngest rider swallowed hard. "I recorded him instead of helping." Marcus looked around the circle. "We're going to find him. And when we do..." He paused. "We're going to make this right." Every engine started at once. Not for a ride. For a search. 20 motorcycles spread across western Colorado, looking for the homeless man who had disappeared after saving them all. Late that night, Isaiah sat beneath the porch of an abandoned church to escape the cold mountain rain. He was almost asleep when headlights swept across the empty road. A black pickup truck stopped nearby. 3 men stepped out. None wore uniforms. The tallest carried a flashlight. "There he is." Isaiah quietly stood. "What do you want?" The man smiled coldly. "Our boss made you an offer. You should have taken it." Isaiah remained calm. "I'm not leaving." The smile disappeared. "You don't seem to understand." The second man kicked Isaiah's backpack across the wet pavement. Notebooks spilled into puddles. Rain-soaked pages filled with years of careful calculations. Isaiah lunged instinctively toward them. The tallest man shoved him backward. "You've had 18 years to keep your mouth shut." His voice turned icy. "Now don't make tonight your last mistake." They climbed back into the truck and disappeared into the darkness. Isaiah slowly crawled across the rain-soaked ground, gathering each notebook with trembling hands. Several pages had torn free and drifted into the rushing gutter. He chased them desperately, not because they were paper, Because they were evidence. Evidence no one else knew existed. Across the street, hidden beneath the awning of a closed diner, someone had witnessed everything. Emily Carter lowered her camera with shaking hands. She had followed an anonymous tip, hoping to find Isaiah. Instead, she had just recorded 3 unknown men threatening the one witness everyone else seemed desperate to silence. For the first time since this story began, Emily no longer believed she was investigating a bridge collapse. She was investigating a conspiracy, and somewhere inside Isaiah's rain-soaked notebooks, she was certain the truth had been waiting for 18 years. Emily Carter didn't sleep that night. She replayed the video over and over inside her motel room. The 3 men never hit Isaiah. They never mentioned the bridge directly, but every word they spoke carried the same message. Stay silent. She paused the frame where the tallest man kicked Isaiah's backpack. The notebooks scattered across the rain-soaked pavement. Isaiah had lunged after them with more desperation than when he had nearly been run over by 20 motorcycles. Those notebooks mattered more than his own safety. Emily knew exactly where she needed to go. The following morning, she found Isaiah sitting alone outside a small church on the edge of town. Volunteers were serving breakfast to the homeless. He accepted only a cup of coffee. Nothing else. Emily approached slowly. Mr. Brooks. Isaiah looked up immediately, recognizing the young reporter. If you're here for another interview, I'm not. She sat across from him without turning on her camera. I'm here because someone tried to scare you last night. Isaiah remained silent. I saw everything. His eyes narrowed slightly. You shouldn't have followed me. I think someone wanted to make sure you never talked. Isaiah gave a tired smile. They've wanted that for a long time. Emily carefully removed one of the loose notebook pages she had recovered from the street after the attack. I think this belongs to you. Isaiah's expression changed instantly. He accepted the damp page as though it were priceless. Thank you. Emily noticed tears forming in his eyes. What is it? Isaiah gently smoothed the wrinkled paper against his knee. It's 18 years of my life. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had consumed her thoughts. Who were you before everyone started calling you the homeless man under the bridge? Isaiah looked toward the distant mountains. For nearly a minute he said nothing. Then he quietly answered. I was a husband. Another long silence. I was a father. His voice weakened. And I had a profession I loved. What profession? Isaiah slowly closed the notebook. I built things people trusted. Before Emily could ask anything else, he stood. I'm sorry. I'm not ready. He walked away, leaving Emily with more questions than answers. But this time, he hadn't denied having a past. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Ross received the preliminary engineering report. The findings sent a chill through the entire department. The collapse had not been caused by age alone. Several load-bearing bolts had been intentionally loosened months before the failure. Whoever did it understood exactly how long the bridge would continue standing before finally collapsing under heavy vibration. Daniel leaned back in disbelief. This wasn't negligence. His deputy nodded. It was sabotage, and someone tried to make it look like natural deterioration. Daniel immediately thought of Mayor Victor Hale. Not because he had evidence, because the mayor seemed terrified of Isaiah from the very beginning. Across town, Emily visited the Colorado Department of Transportation archives in Denver. This time, she wasn't searching under Isaiah Brooks. She searched old bridge projects connected to Cedar Ridge. Thousands of documents appeared. One bridge immediately caught her attention. Cedar Ridge Canyon Bridge Rehabilitation Project. Construction completed. 18 years earlier. Emily requested the original project files. The archivist disappeared into a storage room before returning with 3 heavy boxes coated in dust. Nobody's asked for these in years. Emily opened the first binder. Inspection reports, material invoices, blueprint revisions. Everything looked routine. Until she reached the final approval page, the chief engineer's signature had been cut away. Not crossed out, not redacted, physically removed. Emily stared at the missing rectangle. Someone had literally sliced the name out of history. Back in Cedar Ridge, Deputy Clerk Susan Morales searched forgotten filing cabinets inside the basement archives of Town Hall. She had come early before anyone else arrived. If Emily was right, there had to be another copy somewhere. After nearly 2 hours, she found a water-damaged storage box labeled simply Bridge Project Confidential. Her hands shook. Inside lay carbon copies of inspection memos. Most had yellowed with age. One immediately caught her eye. Across the top was stamped in bold red letters, "Final Safety Certification Denied." Susan's pulse quickened. The signature at the bottom remained perfectly readable. Isaiah Brooks. She froze. The homeless man hadn't just worked on the bridge, he had refused to approve it. Susan immediately photographed every page. Moments later, footsteps echoed down the hallway. She barely shoved the documents back into the box before Town Attorney Leonard Price entered the archive room. "What are you doing down here?" Susan forced a smile. "Looking for tax records?" Leonard studied her face for a long moment. "You found them. I must have checked the wrong cabinet." He seemed unconvinced. "I'll help you." "No." Susan answered too quickly. "I mean, I already have what I need." She hurried upstairs. Leonard watched her leave before slowly turning toward the shelves. His eyes settled on the same confidential storage box. That afternoon, Emily's phone rang. Susan whispered urgently, "I found his name." Emily stood immediately. "What?" He wasn't guessing. He signed the original safety inspection. Emily stopped breathing. "Are you sure? I have pictures. Meet me now." Less than an hour later, they met inside a quiet coffee shop outside town. Susan slid her phone across the table. Emily opened the first photograph. Her heart pounded. There it was. Chief Structural Engineer Isaiah Brooks below it. Safety certification, denied reason. Critical load-bearing defects require immediate reconstruction before public use. Emily looked up in stunned silence. 18 years ago. Susan nodded. He tried to stop this. Emily flipped to the next image. Another memo. Another warning. Then another. Each one rejected. Each one ignored. Each one signed by Isaiah Brooks. The final page contained a handwritten note that made Emily's blood run cold. If this bridge remains open without repairs, loss of life is inevitable. Emily slowly lowered the phone. The entire room suddenly felt smaller. The old homeless black man, who everyone called crazy, had predicted this disaster nearly 2 decades before it happened. And someone had spent 18 years making sure nobody ever believed him. Outside the coffee shop, neither woman noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Inside sat Mayor Victor Hale. His eyes never left the window. When Emily closed the folder, Victor quietly picked up his phone. His voice was cold. "They've found the files." A pause. Then he gave one final order. "Bring me Isaiah Brooks." Mayor Victor Hale ended the call without another word. The black sedan pulled away from the coffee shop before Emily Carter or Susan Morales ever noticed it had been there. Victor's face remained calm. Inside, panic was taking over. For 18 years, every report had stayed buried. Every witness had disappeared. Every record had been altered. Now everything was unraveling because one homeless black man had refused to die with the truth. Isaiah had no idea he was being hunted. He walked several miles north until he reached an abandoned maintenance yard owned by the state decades earlier. A rusted equipment shed still stood at the edge of the property. He unlocked it with an old key he had quietly carried for years. Inside, dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Broken surveying equipment leaned against one wall. Old blueprints lay scattered across a cracked drafting table. Isaiah slowly walked toward a large steel cabinet hidden beneath a faded canvas tarp. For a long moment, he simply rested his hand on the handle. "I hoped I'd never have to open you again." The lock clicked. Inside were dozens of carefully sealed document tubes, engineering journals, inspection photographs, cassette tapes, and one weathered leather briefcase. Isaiah gently removed the briefcase. Pinned beneath it was an old family photograph. A younger Isaiah smiled proudly beside his wife Angela and their 8-year-old daughter Naomi. His smile disappeared. "I couldn't protect either of you." He quietly placed the photograph inside his coat. Across town, Emily and Susan rushed to Sheriff Daniel Ross's office. Daniel listened without interrupting as Emily spread photographs across his desk. The sheriff stared at the documents, then at Isaiah's signature, then back again. "This can't be real." "It is," Emily answered. He rejected the bridge. Daniel picked up another page. 3 separate inspection requests, all denied. Another report, ignored. Then another, ignored again. Finally, he whispered, "My God." Emily leaned forward. "Someone erased him." Daniel immediately stood. "We're reopening everything." Before he could leave his office, the phone rang. It was the State Bureau of Investigation. The voice on the other end sounded unusually serious. "Sheriff Ross, we've located evidence of financial transfers connected to the bridge project." Daniel's expression hardened. "To who?" "The records point towards several shell companies." A pause followed. One payment eventually reached an account belonging to Victor Hale. Daniel froze. "When?" 18 years ago. At Town Hall, Victor Hale received another visitor. Leonard Price entered without knocking. "We have a problem." Victor looked up. "I know." "No." Leonard swallowed nervously. "It's worse." The State Bureau subpoenaed every financial record connected to the bridge project. Victor's hands slowly clenched into fists. "How long?" "They'll be here this afternoon." Silence filled the office. Victor walked to the window. Crowds still gathered outside discussing Isaiah Brooks. Some even carried handmade signs reading "The homeless man saved them." Victor's jaw tightened. "They're starting to believe him." Leonard spoke quietly. "What if we tell the truth?" Victor spun around. "The truth? You think the truth sends me to retirement?" His voice rose for the first time. "It sends every one of us to prison." Meanwhile, 20 motorcycles rolled into Cedar Ridge together. Residents stepped onto sidewalks as engines echoed through Main Street. Marcus Reed stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Every rider removed his helmet. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to testify. Daniel welcomed them inside. One after another, each biker gave a statement describing exactly what happened on the bridge. How Isaiah had begged. How he cried. How he stood directly in front of speeding motorcycles. Finally, Marcus stepped forward. "I have something else." He placed his phone on Daniel's desk. "I enhanced the original video." Daniel pressed play. The footage zoomed toward the suspension tower, just seconds before Isaiah screamed. A faint metallic popping sound echoed. Marcus paused the recording. Most people heard motorcycles. I heard steel. Daniel replayed it 3 more times. The engineer in him wasn't trained to hear collapsing bridges. Marcus was. He knew exactly what that sound meant, Marcus said quietly. Daniel nodded. I don't think Isaiah was predicting the collapse. Marcus looked up. I think he recognized it. Just after sunset, Isaiah returned to the abandoned maintenance shed. He spread dozens of faded photographs across the drafting table. Every image documented the bridge over 18 years, each crack, each repair patch, each corroded beam, each missing bolt. He reached the final photograph, unlike the others. This one had been taken only 6 months earlier. Isaiah stared at it. His breathing slowed, then his eyes widened. No. He picked up a magnifying glass. The anchor assembly looked different. A bolt, visible in older photographs, had disappeared. Someone had removed it. Months before the collapse. Isaiah immediately grabbed another inspection image. Then another, then another. The same conclusion appeared every time. This had never been simple neglect. Someone had deliberately weakened the bridge. His hands began shaking. They didn't ignore my warnings, he whispered. They finished what they started. Before he could gather the photographs, headlights suddenly flooded the building through broken windows. Several black SUVs surrounded the shed. Doors slammed. Heavy footsteps approached from every direction. Flashlights swept across the walls. A voice thundered through the darkness. Isaiah Brooks. We know you're inside. Another voice followed. You come out with your hands where we can see them. Isaiah slowly extinguished the lantern. The shed fell into complete darkness. Outside, the men believed they had cornered a homeless old man. Inside. Isaiah quietly reached beneath the drafting table and pressed a hidden metal switch installed nearly 20 years earlier. Deep beneath the abandoned building, an old freight elevator groaned to life. There was one place no one in Cedar Ridge remembered anymore. One place only Isaiah knew still existed. And buried below that forgotten maintenance yard was the final piece of evidence capable of destroying every lie Mayor Victor Hale had built his career upon. The rusted freight elevator groaned as it descended into darkness. Above, boots pounded across the abandoned maintenance shed. Flashlights swept through broken windows. Search every room. Isaiah Brooks stood perfectly still inside the old elevator, clutching the weathered leather briefcase against his chest. The doors closed just as one of the armed men burst into the shed, though he was here. A flashlight beam landed on the drafting table. The photographs were gone. The notebooks were gone. So was Isaiah. The man cursed into his radio. He disappeared. Nearly 40 feet below ground, the elevator stopped with a violent jolt. Isaiah stepped into a forgotten inspection tunnel built during the bridge's original construction. The concrete walls were damp, and decades of dust covered abandoned electrical panels. No one had entered this place in years, except him. He switched on an old emergency lantern. Its weak light revealed shelves lined with metal storage boxes, each labeled by year. 2008, 2009, 2010. All the way back to the year the bridge project began. Isaiah slowly opened the oldest box. Inside lay dozens of sealed evidence envelopes. Every inspection photograph, every engineering calculation, every rejected safety report. And something even more important, a stack of original cassette recordings. Each tape carried a handwritten label, Project Meeting Confidential. Isaiah closed his eyes. They never found these. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Ross received an urgent call from the State Bureau of Investigation. Sheriff, we traced the surveillance footage. The men who threatened Isaiah. Yes. They work for Falcon Infrastructure Consulting. Daniel frowned. I've never heard of them. You have? They're the company that inherited maintenance contracts after the original bridge contractor dissolved. Daniel's heart sank. Were they connected to Mayor Hale? A brief silence followed. Then came the answer. They've donated over $2 million to political campaigns connected to Victor Hale during the last 15 years. Daniel immediately grabbed his jacket. Get me every warrant we can. At the same moment, Emily Carter was rushing toward the abandoned maintenance yard after Marcus Reed called her. She arrived to find the building surrounded by deputies. Marcus met her outside. They're gone. Who? The men chasing Isaiah. Emily looked around. What about Isaiah? Marcus pointed toward the empty shed. He vanished. Inside, investigators searched every corner. Daniel walked slowly around the drafting table until something unusual caught his attention. The floor beneath it. Fresh scrape marks. He knelt. The old steel plate looked different from the surrounding concrete. Marcus joined him. You see it too? Daniel nodded. This floor moved. The sheriff ordered everyone back. Minutes later, deputies pried open the concealed hatch. Cold air rushed upward. One deputy aimed his flashlight into the darkness. There's an elevator. Daniel stared downward in disbelief. No one mentioned underground access in any of the bridge plans. Emily quietly answered. Maybe someone erased that too. Deep underground, Isaiah inserted the first cassette into a portable recorder he had carefully preserved all these years. Static filled the tunnel. Then voices emerged. Young voices, confident voices. One of them belonged to Isaiah himself. We cannot certify this bridge. Another man laughed. Nobody's rebuilding it. Isaiah's younger voice answered firmly. Then I won't sign it. Silence. A third voice finally spoke. You'll sign. Or someone else will. The tape abruptly ended. Isaiah slowly removed it. His hands trembled. Not because he had forgotten, because hearing those voices again made the betrayal feel new. Above ground, forensic investigators began examining the hidden elevator. One technician discovered fingerprints preserved beneath decades of dust. Another found electrical maintenance records tucked inside an old control box. Every document carried the same authorization code, IB-17. Daniel stared at the initials. IB, Emily whispered. Isaiah Brooks. Marcus folded his arms. This wasn't some homeless man's hiding place? Daniel nodded. No. It belonged to someone who worked here. Just then, a convoy of black government SUVs rolled into the maintenance yard. Agents wearing jackets marked State Bureau of Investigation stepped out. Leading them was Special Agent Laura Bennett. She walked directly toward Daniel. We're taking over. Daniel handed her the engineering reports. You'll want these. Laura quickly skimmed the documents before stopping on Isaiah's name. She looked up immediately. So, he's alive. Daniel nodded. Yes. Laura took a slow breath. We've been looking for him. Everyone turned toward her. Emily blinked. You already knew who he was. Laura hesitated. Only by file. What file? Laura looked around before answering quietly. 18 years ago, someone inside the state government requested federal assistance after reporting corruption tied to the Cedar Ridge Bridge. What happened? The whistleblower disappeared before we could place him into protective custody. Emily's pulse quickened. Who was the whistleblower? Laura slowly looked toward the open elevator shaft, then at the signature on the inspection report. Finally, she answered, Isaiah Brooks. A stunned silence fell over the entire maintenance yard. Marcus looked toward the dark tunnel below. So all these years, he wasn't hiding from shame. Laura nodded gravely. He was hiding from the people who destroyed his life. Before anyone could speak again, a deputy ran toward Daniel holding a radio. Sheriff, we've got movement. Where? The black SUVs. They've been spotted heading toward the old canyon service roads. Daniel immediately understood. They know Isaiah escaped. Laura's expression hardened. And now they're racing to find him before we do. Within seconds, engines roared to life. Deputies, state investigators, and 20 bikers mounted their motorcycles together, for the second time in less than a week. They weren't racing toward danger. They were racing to save the man who had already saved them, because hidden somewhere beneath the Colorado mountains, Isaiah Brooks carried a briefcase that contained the one piece of evidence powerful enough to expose an 18-year conspiracy and send some of the most powerful people in the state to prison. The race through the Colorado mountains became a desperate contest against time. Sheriff Daniel Ross led the convoy of patrol vehicles. Behind him came the State Bureau of Investigation. Behind them thundered 20 motorcycles, their engines echoing through the canyon Isaiah Brooks had saved only days before. Every radio carried the same message. Locate Isaiah Brooks before the suspects do. Deep inside the forgotten inspection tunnel, Isaiah reached the final steel vault. Unlike the others, this one required 2 keys. He inserted the first from his ring. The second had remained hidden inside the heel of his boot for 18 years. The lock clicked. The heavy door slowly swung open. Inside rested a single fireproof document case. Isaiah lifted it onto an old drafting table. His hands trembled not from fear, but from memory. This ends today. He opened the case. Inside were the original bridge blueprints bearing the official state seal untouched inspection reports, financial ledgers, handwritten engineering calculations, and the complete collection of audio recordings from every safety meeting. At the very bottom lay one sealed envelope marked, "To be opened if any loss of life occurs." Isaiah stared at it for several seconds before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a notarized sworn statement written in his own handwriting 18 years earlier. He began reading aloud. My name is Isaiah Brooks, Chief Structural Engineer for the Cedar Ridge Canyon Bridge Project. I refuse to certify this bridge because its primary load-bearing system contains critical defects. I have been ordered to approve construction despite knowing the bridge is unsafe. If this document is ever found, it means my warnings were ignored and innocent lives have been placed at risk. Isaiah slowly closed his eyes. Everything he had lost suddenly returned to him. The meetings, the threats, the lies, the day his entire life was stolen. Above ground, Special Agent Laura Bennett's convoy reached the maintenance yard just as another call came over the radio.
We've intercepted financial records, Daniel immediately answered. What did you find? The shell companies weren't just hiding money. They were paying witnesses. Another pause. And someone else. Who? The former director of state infrastructure. Daniel's grip tightened around the steering wheel. What was his role? He personally removed Chief Engineer Isaiah Brooks from the project 3 days after Isaiah refused to sign the safety certification. Marcus Reed, riding beside the sheriff, heard every word through the shared radio channel. So they didn't fire him because he was wrong, Marcus muttered. They fired him because he refused to lie. Meanwhile, Mayor Victor Hale stood inside Town Hall watching dozens of reporters gather outside. Every minute, more state investigators arrived. His phone rang again. He answered immediately. "Tell me." The voice on the other end sounded panicked. "We couldn't find him." Victor slammed his fist onto the desk. "What about the documents? They're gone." Victor closed his eyes. Then he quietly whispered, "It's over." But before he could move, another call interrupted. This one came from the governor's office. "Victor, you've been ordered to remain in your office. The State Bureau has obtained federal warrants." Victor slowly lowered the phone. For the first time in 18 years, he realized there would be no escape. Underground Isaiah inserted the oldest cassette into the recorder. Unlike the previous tapes, this one contained the entire final meeting. Voices filled the tunnel. A younger Isaiah spoke with calm determination. "I will not approve a bridge that can kill families." Another voice answered sharply. "Do you understand how much money is riding on this project? I understand that steel doesn't negotiate." The room fell silent. Then another familiar voice entered the recording. Victor Hale, much younger, much colder. "Sign the certification, Isaiah, or you'll never work as an engineer again." Isaiah answered without hesitation. "Then I'll find another way to live." Victor laughed. "You won't have a life left to rebuild." The recording ended. Isaiah stared at the recorder. He had not listened to that conversation since the day he secretly copied it. Now, the entire truth was preserved forever. Suddenly, voices echoed through the tunnel. "Isaiah, this is Sheriff Ross. We're coming down." Moments later, Daniel Laura Bennett, Emily Carter, Marcus Reed, and several SBI agents entered the underground archive. They stopped the instant they saw the walls. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of engineering reports, every inspection carefully catalogued over 18 years. Emily whispered, "My God." Laura slowly walked toward the drafting table. "Is all of this yours?" Isaiah nodded. "I knew someday someone honest would come looking." Daniel looked around in disbelief. "You documented everything. Every inspection, every repair, every missing bolt." Isaiah answered quietly. Because I knew the truth would need witnesses." Laura opened the fireproof case. Her eyes widened. Original state
Seals, original engineering stamps, untouched financial records. Then she picked up Isaiah's employment identification card. For the first time, everyone in the room saw the man standing before them as he once was. The photograph showed a confident black engineer wearing a white hard hat. Beneath it read, "Isaiah Brooks, Chief Structural Engineer, Colorado Department of Transportation." Marcus stared, speechless. Emily covered her mouth. Sheriff Ross slowly removed his hat. All those years. The town had mocked a homeless black man without knowing they were insulting the very engineer who had tried to save them nearly 2 decades earlier. Laura looked directly into Isaiah's eyes. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice carried deep respect. On behalf of the State Bureau of Investigation, she extended her hand. "Welcome back." Isaiah hesitated only a moment before shaking it. Tears quietly filled his eyes. Not because his title had returned, but because for the first time in 18 years, someone finally believed him. At that same moment, dozens of armed agents surrounded Cedar Ridge Town Hall. Federal warrants were read aloud. Mayor Victor Hale stepped out of his office in stunned silence as investigators carried box after box of financial records into waiting vehicles. The conspiracy that had buried Isaiah Brooks for 18 years had finally collapsed, and the final judgment was only hours away. Sunrise broke over Cedar Ridge on the morning the truth finally became impossible to hide. Television crews lined the courthouse steps. State investigators carried boxes of evidence inside, while reporters crowded behind security barriers, waiting for the announcement that would change the town forever. The people who had once laughed at Isaiah Brooks now stood in silence. Many could not even meet one another's eyes. Inside the courtroom, Special Agent Laura Bennett placed the fireproof case onto the evidence table. Every original inspection report, every engineering photograph, every financial ledger, every cassette recording, every document had been authenticated overnight. There was no longer any room for doubt. The presiding judge looked toward Mayor Victor Hale. "Do you dispute the authenticity of these records?" Victor stared at the mountain of evidence before him. His attorney slowly lowered his head. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. Laura then played the final cassette recording. Victor's younger voice echoed through the speakers. "Sign the certification, Isaiah, or you'll never work as an engineer again." Then Isaiah's calm reply filled the room. "People can replace engineers. They cannot replace innocent lives." Not a single person spoke after the recording ended. The judge removed his glasses. For 18 years, he looked directly at Victor. "You allowed an innocent man to carry the burden of your corruption." Victor finally stood. His shoulders sagged. "I never intended for anyone to die." Isaiah, seated quietly in the gallery, answered for the first time. "But you were willing to let them." The words were spoken softly. They carried more weight than any shout. Federal agents stepped forward. To Victor Hale, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, destruction of public records, witness intimidation, and multiple corruption offenses." The former mayor offered no resistance as handcuffs closed around his wrists. Moments later, Leonard Price and 2 former state infrastructure officials were escorted into the courtroom under arrest as well. One by one, the architects of the conspiracy disappeared through the same doors they had once walked through with power. Justice had finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, thousands of people watched the arrests on giant television screens. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The mood was different. It was remorse. Carl Miller, the grocery store owner who had thrown Isaiah's bottles into the street, stood quietly near the back of the crowd. When Isaiah eventually walked outside, Carl stepped forward. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Isaiah simply looked at him. "I treated you like you weren't even human." Carl's voice cracked. "I was wrong." Isaiah placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "We all become better the day we choose to see people before judging them." Carl wiped away tears he had not expected. Nearby, dozens of other residents approached one after another. Some apologized. Others simply thanked him. Isaiah accepted every handshake with the same quiet humility. He never reminded them how they had treated him. He no longer needed to. That afternoon, Governor Elaine Whitmore arrived by helicopter. A temporary stage had been built overlooking the canyon where the old bridge had once stood. Behind her stretched the framework of a new bridge already under construction. Thousands gathered beneath the Colorado sky. Among them stood the 20 bikers whose lives Isaiah had saved. Marcus Reed stepped forward first. On behalf of every rider, he handed Isaiah a polished steel plaque. It read, "To the man who stood alone so that 20 others could ride home." The crowd erupted into heartfelt applause. Then Governor Whitmore approached the podium. 18 years ago, one man chose integrity over comfort. He lost his career. He lost his home. He lost nearly everything. She paused. But he never surrendered the truth. Turning toward Isaiah, she continued, Mr. Isaiah Brooks, today the state of Colorado officially restores your professional honor. An aide presented a framed certificate bearing the state seal. It formally reinstated Isaiah's engineering license and recognized him as the former chief structural engineer whose warnings had saved countless future lives. The governor smiled warmly. We would also be honored if you accepted a new position. Isaiah looked surprised. As senior advisor for infrastructure safety. The audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. Isaiah lowered his head, overwhelmed. I accept. Several months later, the new Cedar Ridge Memorial Bridge officially opened. Unlike the old structure, a bronze monument stood at its entrance. It did not honor politicians. It did not honor donors. It honored one man. The inscription read, Isaiah Brooks. He stood when others laughed. He warned when others stayed silent. He saved lives when the truth cost him everything. Nearby, another plaque carried the names of the 20 bikers who had funded a new nonprofit organization. The Isaiah Brooks Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide shelter, job training, and legal assistance to homeless veterans, displaced workers, and families in crisis, because no one should be judged by the clothes they wear or the place they sleep. As the dedication ceremony ended, Isaiah remained alone on the bridge for a few quiet moments. He rested one hand against the new steel railing. The metal was strong, steady, safe, just as it should have been 18 years earlier. Marcus walked over beside him. You finally got your bridge. Isaiah smiled gently. No. He looked toward families crossing safely together. They finally got theirs. The wind drifted through the canyon. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Isaiah no longer heard steel crying for help. Only laughter. Only life. Only peace. And at last, the man the world had dismissed as a homeless black drifter walked away, not carrying the weight of a forgotten truth, but the quiet dignity of a hero whose courage had rebuilt far more than a bridge.
Sometimes the people the world overlooks are carrying the wisdom that can save it. Never measure someone's worth by their appearance, because integrity, courage, and truth often wear the humblest clothes. If Isaiah's journey touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us why compassion and justice will always matter.